Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like all budgetary statements, the one we heard from the Minister of Finance is laced with exhortations of all types, I might add. But this year they were particularly poignant, and to be generous, I guess the circumstances justified the very special quality of these exhortations. I counted, Mr. Speaker, about 4 or 5 occasions when the Minister of Finance boasted that he and his government was building, quote, a new St. Lucia. You might, for ease of reference, Mr. Speaker, look at, I think, pages 4, you can look at page 36, you can look at page 64. This, Mr. Speaker, is important because that apparently is his mission. And to borrow the word used by the member for Grocery a few moments ago, that is his mantra, his guiding principle, his philosophy. Maybe I should quote him, Mr. Speaker. And let's go to page 4 of the statement. He says, so, Mr. Speaker, from the onset, on being elected to office in 2016, it was clear that the best policy response to the challenges facing the country was to take actions to cause the economy of St. Lucia to grow at a faster rate. Of course, in unofficial circles, the figure of growth that was cited was 6%, maybe 8%. This required a radical change and review of delivery systems, institutional and governance frameworks, and a new approach to the economy. In other words, we had to build a new St. Lucia. He added, in undertaking this task, Mr. Speaker, we identified the need for a new ethos and change in attitude, one which embraced a culture of excellence and a spirit of greater unity, unquote. So there you have it, Mr. Speaker. The mission of the member of Migos South is to create a new ethos, a culture of excellence, and a spirit of greater unity. Mr. Speaker, I am on record as saying that every budget, no matter how badly or insanely that it is crafted, has ideological underpinnings. It gives vital clues about the thinking of the sitting government. It tells us who will benefit from the actions of the government and the policies of the government, who will suffer, which sectors will be marginalized, and who is important and unimportant in the political and economic mission of the government. It says all of that by the choices we make. But you know, Mr. Speaker, it is also the case that no economy can prosper if policies are constructed on the pillars of vindictiveness, retribution, and discrimination. It unnerves everybody. It worries investors. It leads to an uncooperative citizenry. Economic policy must also have its moral underpinnings. So an economy will not flourish if it is constructed or premised on distortions, intellectual dishonesty, lies, misrepresentation, and deceit. These days, these moral underpinnings become even more critical because of the remarkable advance of social media and the availability of information. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, in the history of the politics of this country, you can say something in some remote quarter in a village or community, engage in banality of one kind or another, and really, you didn't care. The media was hardly ever there. Recordings were few and far between, but today, this mobile telephone has made such a vital difference. It's really fascinating, Mr. Speaker, how politicians now have to deal with these mobile telephones and the consequences for the political accountability and political representation. It may be helpful, but it's also a very lethal tool, Mr. Speaker, because now everything we do is the subject of a photograph to be circulated in the social media. But, Mr. Speaker, this budget statement comes before us against a background of two major events. Firstly, just a few days ago, there was a huge island-wide motorcade against the Minister of Finance and his management of the country. Secondly, the Minister of Finance, wearing a different hat than that of Prime Minister, appeared on television as it is his undoubted right to pray for our country and ask for forgiveness for his transgressions. More accurately, for the forgiveness of those whom he had wronged. Laudable, one might be tempted to say. It's always a very tough thing when politicians have to don their coat of humility and apologize and say they are sorry for all kinds of things. I mean, people invent what you should be sorry for sometimes. And some of us end up saying we are sorry for things which in later life you regret you ever said sorry in the first place. But that's the realities of politics. So, laudable, one might be tempted to say. Almost unusual. But one is beginning to see that those who thought that an olive branch was offered are now sadly mistaken. So what has gone wrong? The fact is, Mr. Speaker, this notion of building a new St. Lucia is now beginning to irritate those who hear the statement in the face of what has transpired in the four corners of this little island in the past 4 years. And it is causing us some degree of consternation. Some might agree or disagree. Some might say that some people are stuck in time and place. Others might say there are deeper sensitivities at work. Recently, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Veron Sim wrote as follows on a Facebook page. And I'll quote what she wrote on this subject of a new St. Lucia. You see, Mr. Speaker, we had a very interesting budget, not because of its content, but it was a budget of political economy, hardly a budget of economic policy. But there are times when a country may need budgets like that. She said this: I don't want a new St. Lucia. I love the one I inherited as my birthright. I want to fix her chips, cracks, wear and tear, but preserve her natural, breathtaking beauty. I want to enhance her possibilities without changing her essence. I want her to inspire my great-grandchildren as she has inspired me to a fierce love and unassailable pride. I don't want fake skylines and glittering facades in places of mountainous majesty and shrouded falls. We bandy about this meaningless catchphrase, why do we want to build a new St. Lucia? What will it look like? What will it be? What do we mean? Do we trade in for a new model? Every time I hear some politician talk of a new St. Lucia, I cringe. And I can feel that shudder run through this land from Cap Estate to Mullah Sheikh. Maybe somebody can explain to me and Helen, what is this new St. Lucia place they speak of? Uncle. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, this post was followed by numerous comments, too numerous to engage your attention, Mr. Speaker, because I'm sure, interested as you may be, you probably would disallow it. I guess, Mr. Speaker, we now have instances of what this new St. Lucia means, what it is all about. When, for example, the funds of pensioners at the National Insurance Corporation are used to finance a foreign investor who then proceeds to prepare a land for golf course and in the process destroying what is left of the archaeology on those lands, there is no doubt that we are building a new St. Lucia. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, even the enactment of legislation in this House is touted as evidence of this new St. Lucia. Astonishingly, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance says that the government is engaged in legislative and regulatory reforms to, among other things, quote, create new institutions and systems associated with a new St. Lucia. Again, Mr. Speaker, you will find that reference on page 4 of the budgetary statement. Now, Mr. Speaker, help me. Can you itemize these legislative and regulatory reforms of which the Minister speaks that have helped to create a new St. Lucia? Name, Mr. Speaker, one piece of legislation that has reached this House that was truly original, imaginative, and advanced the rights and interests of St. Lucians. Name one that enlarged their rights. Name one. Of necessity, Mr. Speaker, many of the bills enacted by this government will have to be repealed by any incoming government. I'll just name a few. And I suspect you know why. The Castries Constituency Act setting up the city police will have to be repealed and redrafted. That contains some bizarre and unlawful clauses. The new Aliens and Holding License Act is a veritable mess, confusing and difficult to implement. It has made a process that should have been simple, bureaucratic, and unwieldy. It has become a nightmare for practicing lawyers. And then all the amendments to the CIP Act will have to be repealed. And as the leader of the opposition rightly stated, a new act will have to be enacted once the policy decision is taken to retain that program. We have to go back to the drawing board. A well-intentioned program which attracted the support of the opposition has now been systematically undermined, destroyed, and rendered almost useless. Even the minister's undisguised praise for the legislation governing adoption and protection of children, which incidentally was initially crafted by the former SLP administration, will have to be recalled, reviewed, and amended. The reason why the then government did not proceed with enacting that legislation had to do with the numerous defects in the draft, some of which appeared in the existing legislation before the House. I'm not going to go through the legislation in detail, but some of the provisions are well known. And it is only recently, within days of its enactment, we were back in Parliament to repeal and replace certain sections. But I guess, Mr. Speaker, on reflection, when you really think about it, the Tourism Levy Act and its companion legislation, the St. Lucia Tourism Authority Amendment Act, are bills associated with the New St. Lucia. That's probably what they're talking about. Bills that had to be withdrawn because of a public outcry. And had the government just listened to the pleadings of the opposition, those bills might have been saved with some clinical amendments. But I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that the member for Finance included in his discourse this year issues of security and justice. And a quick reference, Mr. Speaker, because I know you love your references. I think you should look at page 23, to be exact, and you'll see some of those references. Page 23 to 25. But more disappointment. The Minister of Finance could not help himself but once again blames the sanctions imposed by the United States on the bungled impacts investigation directed, he says, by the former administration. But he enjoys protection in the House. He enjoys protection. This is a good opportunity for him to tell the public how the impacts investigation was bungled. After all, he tried to do it from opposition days. The member has had a copy of the impacts report since his days in opposition, furnished, we now know, by a CARICOM government. He's had it. And the question is, what has he done with it since then? But that, Mr. Speaker, is for another matter at the appropriate time. After all, he promised the police officers that the impacts report, the impacts inquiry will be a thing of the past after 3 months in office.
3 months?
Yes, that was the promise. That was the promise on the platforms. We'll take care of it. Kenny Anthony made a mess. As usual, he makes a mess. It is now 4 years. He's had more than enough time to deliver to the police officers. And I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the member for Miku South better hurry. Time is running out because Trump will no longer be the President of the United States after November. Perhaps the member for Miku South could use his Trump card. That's a special card, the Trump card. The card we know that was made available after his betrayal of the majority of members of CARICOM over Venezuela. Took a different path, a different route from his colleagues. Under that same section, Mr. Speaker, the member boldly says we appointed a director of public prosecution. Now, that would have gone unnoticed, Mr. Speaker. No one would have bothered with that. But it's repeated ad nauseum, not just by him, but by his Minister of Justice, I believe. Tell me, where in the Constitution of St. Lucia does the government of St. Lucia, and in particular the Prime Minister, have the right to appoint a DPP? Where? They say this ad nauseum, and the Director of Public Prosecutions, for whatever reason, never stops them to protect his independence and integrity. And that's the problem that I have. That's the problem. And there are other things that are troubling. But leave them for the time being too. As far as I'm aware, Mr. Speaker, this is an appointment made by the Governor General on the advice of the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, who is only required to consult the Prime Minister prior to submitting their recommendation to the GG. Now, Mr. Speaker, you would have thought that the former government did nothing to appoint a DPP. Anybody listening to this? Yet it was the former government that advertised the post. It was the former government who, after the post being advertised, facilitated the process that led to an appointment. You can have time to reply with your wow, you know. You can have time to reply if you have a way you just dodge. Don't dodge today. You come and you appoint a DPP. Yeah, but I had such a constitutional heresy like that. Then he goes on in the same section. The minister proudly announces that the government is poised to commence the construction of the police headquarters and court facility. Few, Mr. Speaker, would question this initiative. Indeed, the leader of the opposition conceded credit. He welcomed this initiative. But of course, this is nothing new in the history of improving facilities for the police force. No government has built as many police stations and fire service buildings as the former government. None. None in the history of St. Lucia. But you know, here comes the rub. Yet, that never saved it from the wrath of the police on election day. So if you believe you're going to buy police officers because you put up buildings, be on guard. But there's a more troubling aspect to this. And I want to handle it in a very delicate way, Mr. Speaker. In a very delicate way. No government, Mr. Speaker, in its right mind, in this day and age, would build a court facility in the precincts occupied by the police. You don't do that. The days when we housed courts in police stations are over. The fact that we commingled the premises in the past does not make it right today. And I remember full well the situation with Ancillary Police Station. There is a court in it. It should never have been in it. But at the time, there were serious economies of scale to consider. But the intention had always been to separate them. Now, why do you want to separate a court from the police? The public must never ever get the impression that the court system is hand in hand with the police. The days when magistrates sat at the same tables with police prosecutors and others when persons were charged are over. The police are not an extension of the judiciary. We have a responsibility to protect the independence of the judiciary. I do not speak for the judiciary. That would be impertinent. But I know I've had discussions with the judiciary over the location of halls of justice. Nobody disagrees with the necessity of a halls of justice for St. Lucia. We all have to bring an end to what pertains currently with courts strewn all over the place. Although very interestingly, Mr. Speaker, and you must have seen it yourself as a practitioner, that I suspect the days of physical facilities may well be coming to an end because COVID has, of course, forced virtual engagements, which, for all purposes, is on trial. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the police and the judiciary at all times must be at arm's length, physically and otherwise. The police must not be seen as arm in arm with the judiciary. They must be seen as separate and distinct, carrying out their responsibilities as prosecutors and, of course, applying the law as the law commands. I urge the government of St. Lucia to rethink this initiative. Unless, of course, it may be one of those times when they believe I'm making noise as usual, criticizing as usual. Maybe they should engage the bar of this country and the judiciary and get a categorical statement of whether this is an advisable option to exercise. By all means, build your police station. By all means, it is needed. No one is questioning that. But a hall of justice, a court facility, should never ever be on the same grounds as a police headquarters. But you know, the saga of destroying the old prison is well known. And all of this is part of building this new St. Lucia. They're building, they say, a new St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, but undertakings by the Attorney General are not worth the paper on which they're given or written. And I suspect after this incident, anybody who is in legal dispute with the government of St. Lucia and is settled between the parties, all will want it to be registered in the court system by way of consent order or otherwise. That's the result. But, Mr. Speaker, this is St. Lucia. As a Calypsonian, Wally sang in that memorable calypso, this is the land of absurdity. That's why we're going to put a court facility side by side with police headquarters. Tempting, timely, and apt as it may be, Mr. Speaker, I will not repeat the lyrics of the calypso. And I suspect you know why. The honorable member, Mr. Speaker, concludes his exegesis on this section of justice, etc., by special commendation, and I might add well-deserved commendation for members of the Royal St. Lucia Police Force. And as an aside, Mr. Speaker, despite their imperfections, despite at times perhaps they made decisions that were not in accordance with the law, because of the extraordinary and unique circumstances, in my own travels up and down during the periods of the curfew, the members of the police force stationed at the Dennery police station were exceedingly kind and respectful. And I thank them. I thank them, Mr. Speaker. But this naked, unashamed politicization of the police force needs to end. And I was very pleased to hear the leader of the opposition make the point that the police force has to be depoliticized and re-established as an independent agency free of the shackles and influence of the political directorate. This government and its Prime Minister is creating a monster in our communities. I don't think it is understood that in some communities, because of the perceived actions, the level of distrust has intensified. That's the reality. And apparently, Mr. Speaker, in this new St. Lucia, Once a police officer does not do the bidding of the government or the police officers aligned to the regime, they are transferred and dispatched to the wilderness. And you know, Mr. Speaker, this happens with such speed. It's remarkable. Really remarkable. But that's the new St. Lucia we want to build. The member for Miku South says he wants to build a more people-centered and inclusive economy. More people-centered and inclusive economy. Mr. Speaker, so you could understand the language of political economy of which I spoke. I see you looking at the clock, Mr. Speaker. Oh, good, because I've just started. Mr. Speaker, why are we marginalizing certain sectors? I understand that some members of this House who have portfolios may have great difficulty in achieving the goals set by their portfolios. May have great difficulty. I will not, of course, name names. I will not offend my good friends. Not at all. But we cannot build an economy if we are marginalizing certain sectors. Hear this, Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a new economy is emerging, one that is diverse, excellence-driven, innovative, and increasingly more resilient. We are building an economy that is more people-centered and inclusive. Those were the concluding words I mentioned earlier. Tell me, you're building a more people-centered and inclusive economy and you're treating fishermen that way? Huh? The fishing complexes which were constructed for their use by the Japanese have been privatized. A new company established, hardly purchasing fish from the fishermen and the fisher folk. Now fishers, traders are back on the street corners or traveling from one end of the island to the next end to hawk their fish to make a living. And we talk of an inclusive economy? Is that really what we want them to put them out on the streets? Let the vans from Beaufort travel from Beaufort to Castries on a regular basis looking for clients, customers to purchase fish? Hotels are closed and so they cannot sell their fish to them. As I said, the new operators of the complex hardly purchase fish from them. We pleaded in this House, Mr. Speaker, that concessions be granted to them, especially in face of the new tax on fuel imposed by this government. All to no avail. Apparently, and this is a lesson learned, the fishers were important for boats, but not for the economy. Not for the economy. I say to you, Mr. Speaker, wonders never cease. It's a popular statement. Check out this statement on page 64 of the budget presentation, Mr. Speaker. Check it out. It says, quote, "Our quest to build a new St. Lucia together can only be accelerated and indeed sustained if it is ingrained in our values as a nation. Culture is a fabric that nurtures and ultimately gives expression to the principles, and listen to the principles, such as innovation, excellence, discipline, sacrifice, thrift, respect, among others." These are the principles of the new culture, new cultural dispensation to be shaped by this government. Innovation, excellence, discipline, sacrifice, thrift, respect, among others. And you know, discipline is a word, when you're talking to artists, you have to be very cautious how you use it. It's one word they don't easily entertain. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is a most unusual description of the place of culture in our evolving society. But this is the new St. Lucia, they say. Ominously, Mr. Speaker, the protection of our heritage and patrimony is excluded from the list of principles. No mention of heritage or patrimony. I guess these are useful words. These are unhelpful words, Mr. Speaker. Patrimony and heritage. You get rid of heritage tourism. You don't want to use that word, because you must discard what made you and what shaped you. Heritage don't matter. And this is the same Minister of Finance that punished the National Trust by stripping it of its subvention because it refused to do its bidding. This is the same Minister of Finance who, by denying the trust an annual subvention, caused the National Trust to close the exhibition home of Derek Walcott. Now, the noble statements about developing culture. But then, Mr. Speaker, this is the new St. Lucia, where punishment is meted out to those who disagree with the administration. That's the new St. Lucia. Welcome, Mr. Speaker, to the new St. Lucia. Let me now, Mr. Speaker, turn to some COVID-related issues. Mr. Speaker, no one has blamed the Minister of Finance for the COVID crisis. Yesterday, the leader of the opposition was at pains to make that point in his contribution. He certainly has been criticized for certain decisions made by him during the shutdown. The sudden shutdown made on the day it occurred was stupid and amateurish. But that's history. These things happen. But, Mr. Speaker, in the political exegesis of this budget statement, which, as I said, is more a statement of political economy rather than budgeting, there are burning questions for which the budget provided no answers. And I hope in his reply, some answers will be provided. Why is it, Mr. Speaker, despite the opening of our so-called borders, that airlines operating out of the United States have not arrived in St. Lucia? Why is it that bookings suddenly appeared and then disappeared? Why? Was it an issue with the protocols for arriving passengers, or with the fact that St. Lucia maintains a state of emergency, or both? What is it? After all, other countries in the Caribbean, Antigua, for example, have started to receive flights from the United States. More crucially, Mr. Speaker, and I will come back to that in a few minutes, why is it that the NIC has not been able to make payments to hundreds of persons? Why just some? Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious issue. Because, you know, as parliamentarians, the questions are directed to us. And I will share with you in a few moments the plight of one worker who communicated with me this morning. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is this, that there is a wall of silence from the National Insurance Corporation. You can't reach them, you can't talk to them. And you know, Mr. Speaker, there's a habit developing in this country where senior public servants, senior managers in the public service do not take calls from parliamentarians or return calls to parliamentarians. No matter how helpful you may wish to be or how urgent the matter may be. In this period, the director of the National Insurance Corporation should have been available to each and every parliamentarian so that queries can be addressed. But alas, try to find him. Then there is another question. For how long will NIC provide support to eligible recipients? Tell me, Mr. Speaker, what happens after September 30th, 2020? We have some information to hand. We know that there are some hotels that are not going to open in this country until October. And we had a disastrous situation in Coconut Bay where 400 workers were made redundant. Not a word. The question is, Mr. Speaker, should Coconut Bay in these times have taken the route of making all its employees redundant? Surely, did we not just amend the law recently to provide an opportunity to protect these workers? Why couldn't Coconut Bay have engaged the workers in discussions and say, all right, we are not in a position to pay you at this time, but we want you to proceed on leave until such time that we can call you back to work? But everybody made redundant, so new staff eventually and presumably will be appointed. Why that route? Why that approach? The question is, what happens to the workers of this country if the effects of COVID-19 continue to paralyze the economy well beyond December 2020? These are questions that we have to ponder, for which answers are necessary and urgent. As I said, Mr. Speaker, there are workers in the country who after 3 months are still unable to get any support from the National Insurance Corporation. And I mentioned that one of my constituents messaged me this morning to say, quote, "It's going on 3 months, I have no income. I am renting. I have kids to take care of. And them kids have to go to school to prepare for CXC. What are we giving them to eat in school when we have no income?" Unquote. Now, you might want to dismiss him. Maybe you call him a political sycophant. I don't know why he chose to send me this message except to draw to the attention of the House to the plight of individuals in his situation. That is what the leader of opposition was talking about in his contribution yesterday. We must reach these people, touch them, and try to redeem their situation. No one is communicating. No one. No one is telling them, we will get to you, bear patience. No one is telling them the records we are getting from your employers are insufficient and inadequate. We are waiting for more information. No one is saying anything to them. And meanwhile, they continue in a sea of despondency and despair. And I can't tell them anything. I can't reach the director to speak to the director. You know, it should be made mandatory to all heads of statutory bodies and organizations that they make their contact numbers available to parliamentarians. Now, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, while I make that criticism of some of these individuals who head statutory bodies, there are ministers of government and staff who, when approached, do respond, as it should be. Because in this parliament, you may be a minister, but we are co-equals. And it's only courtesy. But not so with some of these permanent secretaries, not with some of them, and those who head these organizations. Mr. Speaker, the above questions must be answered and must be answered quickly. If there is worry about the ferment in this country, if there is worry about the anger in this country, if there is worry about the anxiety, we need to do things to calm the distress, the uncertainty. The fact of the matter is, by now there should be a clear roadmap of how we will navigate the next few months. We are dealing with people's lives. It is one thing, Mr. Speaker, to lay out the roadmap for your grandiose projects and talk about the jobs they will create. And we have heard all these promises about jobs before, but it is a different thing this time because we are touching the sensibilities of people's existence. That is what is in issue. I had an honorable member from Eagle South talk about the food parcels and so on. It was one off. I had over 10,000 was distributed. I got about 225 for a population of 9,000. But this lunch program where people are fed on Sundays, I heard he mention about 2,500 meals. I can't recall any meals reaching Beaufort, except one occasion. I believe it was Easter Sunday. Yes, you open your mouth, you get in brave. You open your mouth, you get in brave. But Mr. Speaker, I'm not yet in the mood to entertain you. So let's stay there for a minute, Mr. Speaker. Ask the members on this side, Mr. Speaker, how many of them are aware of the meals in their communities? Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to repeat my concerns about the plight of the small business sector. Of course, there was a little merriment the last time when I made a suggestion, and of course everybody told me, oh, your mathematics is wrong, blah, 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 blah. Of course, I was thinking on my feet, of course. But that doesn't distract from the real challenge that we face. The government's answer to the plight of the small business sector is twofold in this budget. Twofold. And I'm not talking about the other program they're administering from the Office of the Prime Minister. Why on earth they're administering that program from the Office of the Prime Minister, I don't know. But be that as it may, some other person will deal with that. In the budget, the Minister of Finance says a 50% waiver of commercial property taxes to landlords who extend moratoriums of a minimum of 20% of monthly rental charges for 3 months. 3 months. And then, for those presumably who are eligible for corporate taxes, a tax deduction of 20% of the monthly rental value for a period of 6 months. And those proposals, Mr. Speaker, may be seen at pages 31 and 32. I guess beggars cannot be choosers, Mr. Speaker. Some may think that this is well-intentioned. But I say this, on their own, these two proposals will not have any significant impact on the sector. First, many companies do not even bother to pay property taxes. I suspect that the list of defaulting commercial houses owing property taxes must be as long as a Hansard that emerges from these meetings here. Secondly, how does a small business operator benefit if the commercial property is exempted from the payment of property tax? Now, let's be clear. There may not be many properties that are exempted from the payment of property tax, but I do know there are properties within the tourism sector that is exempted from property tax. And there are some commercial operations in this country. It may well be the case that special provisions were made for them in respect of their property taxes. I'm not suggesting anything untoward. All I'm saying is that they got concessions. That is not going to be helpful, Mr. Speaker. It's not really going to touch the difficulties that these people face, the small retailers, the people who own small restaurants, people who have small IT shops, that whole range, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, you have 15 minutes.
How much, Mr. Speaker?
15
Are you
minutes.
inventing time?
No, sir.
I don't believe I have 15 minutes, Mr. Speaker. To quote the language of the member for Library, I was just about to get into full flight. But the payment of rental and public utilities are the two most critical costs that small businesses face. They badly need financial help to survive. Yes, the banks are helping. Yes, the banks are giving a moratorium on loans. But the banks have not said you're not going to pay interest. The banks have said you have to pay interest. All we are doing is reorganizing your loan because we are deferring payments until such time you can get on your feet. The fact is some of them will never get on their feet. Speaker, the small business sector needs financial help to survive. Not just moral suasion laced with palliatives to landlords. Lucelec must be urged to enter into special agreements with these businesses to handle their cost of electricity. Lucelec don't want to make any public statement of what it is doing, Mr. Speaker, because it fears a backlash. But what prevents Lucelec from meeting or engaging the Minister for Commerce and working out arrangements for these people to deal with the monumental bills that they have? Mr. Speaker, I don't know if it helps. Already I'm told that several shops have been closed at the JQ Mall. I don't know how many. You say 6, sometimes I hear 11. I don't know. Again, Mr. Speaker, I urge that some of the money NIC has made available be invested in the small business sector. I urge that this happens, no matter what the amount may be, but reach out. Mr. Speaker, as usual, we have heard a lot about the growth rate in St. Lucia. The economy has grown every year since we've been in office, is the claim. Now, I'm a little surprised because, in this budget debate, I didn't think that would have been an issue at this stage. I thought, frankly, we might have been talking about our collective response to COVID and our experiences. It would make a difference if parliamentarians sat next to each other and discussed what they are facing in their constituencies, instead of the formality of a meeting like this. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, the different authorities cite different figures for the growth rate over the last 4 years. The Economic and Social Review says one thing, always provisional, they caution. CDB says another. ECCB still another. I will use the most authoritative source, that of the IMF, from its 2019 report on the economy of St. Lucia. Here are the figures at both market prices and factor cost. GDP at market prices. St. Lucia, 2015, Labour Party in office, 0.2. 2016, UW in office from June, 3.2. 2017, 2.6. 2018, 0.9. You have that? Yes, in 2018, the growth rate was 0.9. These are IMF figures. In 2019, 1.5. I told you that these are IMF figures. GDP at factor cost now. 2015, 2%. 2016, 1.3. 2017, 2.4. 2018, 0.6. 2019, 1.5. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me put it simply. The difference between market prices and factor costs is that market prices include subsidies and indirect taxes. Factor costs might well be a better indicator of how people are doing, but I just leave that there for the time being. Let us zero in on the growth rate for 2016. Why does this government insist that it is responsible for the growth rate in 2016? Why? You came into office in June 2016. You did not enact a budget after you came into office. You waited until the following year. The much vaunted reduction, stop looking at the clock, we just start. The much vaunted reduction, I'm just teasing you. You're looking, relax. The much vaunted reduction in value-added tax occurred, I believe, sometime in February of the following year. Mr. Speaker, how then can you argue when growth rate is calculated on a calendar basis? How then can you argue, Mr. Speaker, that you are responsible for that growth rate? What you are responsible for is a growth rate in 2017 of 2.6, 0.9 in 2018, and 1.5 in 2019. And if you notice, Mr. Speaker, from the high point of 3.2, it is a deceleration downwards. And you come to this house and argue passionately about growth? When you listen to the members of the government, especially yesterday, you would think that since 2016, St. Lucia has one of the best performing economies in the OECS. Mr. Speaker, look at these figures. Please, look at these figures. And I'm quoting this time from the CDB Annual Economic Review for 2019. Now, judge for yourself, Mr. Speaker. Judge for yourself. IMF didn't provide those figures. That's why you have to go to CDB. Anguilla,
Mr. Speaker,
in 2018, its growth rate was 10.9.
I'd like to invoke Section 3210 to give the member an extra half hour to complete his presentation.
Mr. Speaker, I decline the offer. I decline the offer. All my life, I have always operated within the time's limit and the time schedule. Antigua and Barbuda, growth rate in 2018, 7.4. 2019, 5%. Dominica, 2.3. 2019, 5.7. Grenada in 2018, 4.1. In 2019, 3.0. Montserrat, 4.0 in 2018. 2019, 4.5. St. Kitts and Nevis, 2.9 in 2018. In 2019, 2.5. St. Lucia, 1.1 in 2018. In 2019, 1.5, and these are CDB's figures. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2.2 in 2018, and in 2019, 1.9. You know what these figures mean, Mr. Speaker? This economy and growth rate they're boasting about. In 2008, St. Lucia was at the bottom, the last on the list in the OECS. In 2018, it was the last in 2018. In 2019, it was one before the last. Enough of that, Mr. Speaker. I want to look at this issue now this famous issue of debt to GDP ratio. The Minister of Finance suggests at page 5 of his budget, Mr. Speaker, that the debt to GDP ratio for 2019 had fallen below, quote, the prudential 60% target set by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank to be achieved by 2030. The matter of rebasing the GDP for St. Lucia has already been ventilated in this House, and yesterday the Leader of the Opposition explained the unusual benefits of rebasing. And this government has enjoyed 2 episodes of rebasing since it's got into office. Most unusual. But you know, this Minister of Finance cannot point to a single action he took to reduce the debt GDP ratio of St. Lucia, not one. It was done for him by Cartac on 2 occasions when the GDP figures were rebased. You cite one policy that led to a reduction in the debt to GDP ratio. But let me quote, Mr. Speaker, just for the historical record, from page 46 of the Annual Economic and Financial Review 2019, published by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. It says, quote, the total disbursed outstanding debt increased by 4.3% to $3,485.4 million at the end of 2019. This development resulted in a marginal increase in the debt to GDP ratio to 64.9% relative to 64.3% recorded in 2018. Mr. Speaker, put the jury on notice. Who should we believe? The government of St. Lucia or the CDB? Or the ECC? You choose. Mr. Speaker, let me say this. Allow me to make a very simple observation. And I don't make it for the benefit of members of the House. There are those who believe that even if your debt to GDP ratio is within the so-called prudential limits, your economy cannot collapse. Nothing is further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, our country can be within the prudential limit and yet finds itself in a position where it cannot service its existing debt obligations. There comes a time when the pyramid collapses. You cannot continue to borrow and borrow to pay existing debt. Whether you survive depends on whether you are generating sufficient revenue to meet your obligations, that is to say salaries, wages, debt, payment of services, and now, of course, as we know for this year, election projects. Permit me, Mr. Speaker, to further explain the issue relating to the debt to GDP ratio. And I mentioned to the House on a previous occasion how I faced a situation like that in 2012, 2013. We were having difficulties. The regional government securities market were not buying our bonds. As is happening now. And we had a major bondholder to satisfy. That is when the Ministry of Finance came to me and said, Prime Minister, head to the IMF. And yes, like you probably will do sometime, I slept over it and declined. I then raised a loan of $40 million in Trinidad to meet that commitment. That's how we survived it. And once we did, then of course, other things started to kick in. I just want to say that 2 countries can have the very same debt to GDP ratio, but have very different economic fortunes. The issue is not simply one of high debt to GDP ratio. Other factors such as confidence of investors in the management of the country and the ability of the country to repay its debt and the occurrence of external shocks will all impact the likely outcome. Mr. Speaker, I can say so much more about this matter, but time. Suffice it, Mr. Speaker, to note that given that the 2 factors which I have just highlighted do not currently exist in St. Lucia this time, it is possible that we can find ourselves in a situation where, despite the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is hovering around 60% or more, we do not have the necessary liquidity to service our debts, or where investors are unwilling to roll over existing debt instruments. This is not playing politics, but this is just issuing a very salutary warning. You know, Mr. Speaker, I have been accused of all sorts of things in this House. I've been told I'm mischievous, irresponsible, insincere. All I can say is that never say that a warning was not issued. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to touch very briefly on the borrowing for this budget. It follows logically from what I've said. Mr. Speaker, I note that the borrowing requirement for this year's budget is set at EC 550 million. Recall, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Finance had indicated on a prior occasion that St. Lucia has approximately 700 million in bonds to roll over between April and September 2020. That's what we face, Mr. Speaker. When this 700 million is added to the estimated 267 million in new bonds required, it comes to a gross total of EC 967 million that St. Lucia would need to raise. And we have an instrument before us to approve in this sitting of the House. Almost $1 billion. The question, Mr. Speaker, is this: who will invest in all of these bonds? Is it the institutional investors who are already at their limit with St. Lucia's bonds? The banks who recently and rightly rejected an offer to buy those same bonds from the public servants? Who? Who? And if we don't resolve this problem, then all the projects that you hope to finance for the elections will come to naught. Just consider this. What is the probability of any government raising $1 billion on the debt market in the environment of COVID-19 and the global economic collapse? My opinion, Mr. Speaker, of no value to the members of the House, only to the people of St. Lucia. I say to them that this budget aims to remove the masks from our mouths and noses, and we should place them instead over our eyes. Citizens who love this country must pull off their masks and examine this budget carefully to really determine what opportunity lies therein for the average St. Lucia. So, Mr. Speaker, this is the new St. Lucia. Borrow and borrow till their capacity is exhausted. Finance growth by artificial means, by borrowing again and again. Mr. Speaker, my comments on my constituency, I had intended to be a little detailed. I'm sorry I missed this morning's sitting. I apologize, Mr. Speaker. You know, the House always presents its own theater. And I apologize that I was not here to hear all the members. These days, with a shortened time for debate, we have to rush and prepare. Finding time is always an issue. Because the leader of the opposition asked to respond to a budget the very next day. He's not even given 24 hours to go through the budget. We can't even meet as parliamentarians to discuss the budget. Something so important, but we like it so. But I understood that some comments were made about the children's home in Beaufort and how I don't care, and I may make a mistake in what I say in summarizing, that I've never made any contribution to the children's home. And here comes this government that has made an annual subvention of $240,000 to assist the home. You know, people talk about these things and sometimes they don't bother to ask questions, even if they want to cast judgment. I don't even think that the member who raised this issue knows the history of the children's home. It wasn't this government that built the children's home. I'll tell you how it was done. When the members of the Children's Society in Beaufort reached the point where they wanted to build a home, they came to me as their parliamentary representative. It is the Labour cabinet that made available the site where the children's home is located. They then said to me that they can't raise the rest of the funds to build a home. And I said to them, just by chance, I may have an answer for you. I'll tell you what the answer was. The same gentleman you all vilify, then High Commissioner of St. Lucia to London, he alerted me, Mr. Speaker, that a well-known St. Lucian footballer, Jermaine Defoe, would be visiting St. Lucia and had expressed interest in assisting charity projects. I asked him, you were there, whether he can raise with them the possibility of constructing a children's home. And that's what happened. Mr. Defoe and his mother family came down. We had discussions. They met the persons who were behind the children's home, and they agreed that they will help to finance it. That's how that children's home came into existence. And just for public information, the children's home is not, Mr. Speaker, in Vieux Fort South proper. It's actually in Vieux Fort North. But I like its approach. It speaks of the Vieux Fort Children's Home. So when people make their statements, they ought to be a little more careful. But as to the member, I'm sorry she's not here because I want to tell her I want to tango with her. Yes, I want to tango with her. I don't want to tangle. A tango. And when we do that tango, Mr. Speaker, everything will be on the table. Everything will be on the table, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I say no more. But before I engage in the tango, I will look, everything will be on the table. Mr. Speaker, I will look at what was said and then arrange and issue the invitation to the tango. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have to close because you have told me the time is up. From the tenor of my contribution, you will probably agree that I have submitted that the chickens are coming home to roost. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me also say that I wanted to comment on other things in my constituency that were mentioned, the so-called project by Invest St. Lucia. You know, this government fascinates me. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, that they really don't always come up with new things? Do you know the road they want to build across the airport fence and put up 2 small hotels was a project that was conceptualized in the 1970s, you know. Maybe that's when you served as, so you're trying to recreate what you may have been part of unwisely. But you know, Mr. Speaker, and there are several reports, all I will say at this stage is this, and I believe you are the Minister for Invest St. Lucia, is that right? Are you? Good. When Invest St. Lucia makes promises to people, we must keep them. It said to me that whatever report of their consultants will be made available to me, and they will engage the community of Vieux Fort to discuss what proposed. But they have already rushed to physical planning to get approval in principle. My friend, tread warily. Tread very warily. And for what it is worth, I put you on notice. I put you on notice to talk to your agency about the implication of making public promises to communities at large. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, I have sat in this House and heard countless occasions how the former Labour administration presided over the worst economic performance ever. Oh gosh, every day we hear it. Every day. Everything we did was wrong. The Minister of Finance didn't know what he was about. We did not have a clue about economic management. Never mind the record I just gave you on economic performance for this country. Not even the fact that we had to manage an inherited fiscal deficit approximately of 10% of GDP in the middle of the global financial crisis is acknowledged. If anything, it is ridiculed. The Minister of Finance in his presentation once again disclosed that the ECCB has estimated that St. Lucia's GDP will decline by some 18%. This is staggering. It would certainly be astounding If this is so, Mr. Speaker, it would mean that the honorable member for Mico South will preside over the worst decline in St. Lucia's economic performance since independence.
Honorable member, you should
That
be
is
wrapping up
what
now.
it will mean. Yes, I know you want to stop me, Mr. Speaker. The jury will have to decide, Mr. Speaker, whether his handling of the economy prior to the COVID pandemic accelerated the decline, no matter what he or others say. The real test, Mr. Speaker, is the handling of the path to recovery of the economy. That will be the test. Mr. Speaker, we will await the judgment of history. I thank you.